Welcome my channel. Today's story is one of mercy, danger, and a love that history tried to erase. This is the true and haunting tale of a Cherokee woman who rescued a wounded enslaved man, only for that single act of compassion to turn into a forbidden love that could have cost them both their lives. This story is built from real historical accounts, oral Cherokee traditions, and records buried deep in the past. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Uncovering true stories like this takes countless hours of research, cross-checking sources, and separating myth from fact. He was running on instinct alone when his body finally gave out. The slave had escaped under cover of night, blood soaking through the torn fabric of his shirt. Every breath a sharp, burning pain. A bullet or blade, no one would ever know which, had torn into his side as he fled the plantation, and by the time he crossed into Cherokee land, his strength was gone. He collapsed near the riverbank, half submerged in mud and reeds. Convinced this was where he would die. The sounds of the forest blurred together as his vision dimmed, and the last thing he remembered was the water turning red beside his hand. In those days, escape meant more than freedom. It meant a death sentence, if caught. Slave patrols hunted relentlessly, and anyone found aiding a runaway faced brutal punishment. The wounded man knew this. He had chosen the Cherokee lands not because they were safe, but because they were unknown. Many plantations avoided them, fearing conflict or retaliation, and the forest itself offered cover. But the injury had been too severe. Fever set in quickly, his body shaking violently as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Every sound felt distant, like it was happening underwater. When the Cherokee woman found him, she did not scream. She had come to the river at dawn to gather medicinal roots, her basket already half full, when she noticed something unnatural. Birds silent, the water moving strangely slow. Then she saw him. At first, she thought he was already dead. His skin was cold, his breathing shallowed, his eyes barely open. Blood had dried into the dirt beneath him, dark and cracked. She stood there for a long moment, knowing exactly what this meant. Helping him could bring violence to her people. Ignoring him would be easier, safer. But she knelt anyway. She saw the wound immediately deep, infected, and already swelling. The smell told her everything. Death was close. She pressed her fingers lightly against his neck and felt the faintest pulse. That was enough. She dragged him away from the open riverbank, using every ounce of strength she had, pulling him into the cover of trees, where patrol eyes were less likely to wander. Every step left a trail she carefully erased with branches and leaves. Moving with the quiet precision taught since childhood, he slipped into delirium as she worked. He whispered names, a mother, a sister, a child, voices from a life he believed he'd already lost. At one point, he tried to push her away, his fear overpowering his weakness. "Leave me," he murmured, barely audible. "They'll kill you." She said nothing, only tightened the cloth around his wound and lifted him again. By the time she reached a small, hidden shelter near the edge of the forest, his fever was raging. She cleaned the wound with river water and crushed herbs, ignoring the way her hands shook. She knew these plants, knew which ones drew out poison, which slowed bleeding, which eased pain. Her grandmother had taught her, just as hers had taught before. She packed the wound carefully, whispering prayers under her breath, not to a single god, but to the spirits of the land. asking only that he be allowed to live through the night. For 2 days, he hovered between life and death. She stayed with him constantly, feeding him water drop by drop, wiping sweat from his brow, cooling his skin when the fever burned too hot. Several times, she heard distant voices in the woods, and men shouting, dogs barking, and each time she froze, heart pounding, ready to disappear deeper into the land if she had to. But she did not leave him. On the 3rd morning, his breathing changed. Slower, stronger, when his eyes finally focused. The first thing he saw was her silhouette against the light filtering through the trees. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. She placed a finger gently against his lips, signaling silence, and gave him water. Their eyes met for the first time, his filled with disbelief. He her steady but wary. He understood immediately what she had done. She had chosen him over her own safety, over peace, over everything. In that moment, the wounded slave realized something more terrifying than the pain in his body. He was alive because of her, and that meant their fates were now tied. He could not leave yet. He could barely move. And she, by saving him, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The forest around them felt different now, no longer just a place of refuge, but a boundary between worlds, between captivity and freedom, between duty and desire, between what was allowed and what was forbidden. Neither of them spoke it aloud, but they both knew this act of mercy had already changed everything. She understood the risk the moment she touched him. In that era, helping a wounded runaway slave was not an act of kindness. It was an act of defiance. It could bring armed patrols, punishment, even death, not just to her, but to her family and her people. The laws of the surrounding states were clear and merciless, and while Cherokee land offered some protection, it was not immunity. Slave catchers crossed boundaries when money was involved, and violence followed close behind. She knew all of this as she knelt beside him, her fingers slick with blood, her heart pounding louder than the river behind her. For a long moment, she hesitated, not because she lacked compassion, but because compassion had consequences. She had been raised to understand balance, that every action stirred the world around it. Her elders taught her that mercy carried weight, and that saving one life could endanger many others. She imagined the faces of her family, the children in her community, the elders who depended on the fragile peace they had carved out. Walking away would protect them. Walking away would be easy. But when she looked at the man's face, something inside her refused to turn cold. He was not begging. He was not even conscious enough to plead. His body was already surrendering, his breath shallow, uneven, like the final flickers of a dying flame. She saw no threat in him, only suffering, the kind that came from years of cruelty layered upon a single, violent wound. Leaving him there would not be neutrality. It would be a choice. She made her decision quietly, without ceremony or prayer. She did not announce it to the spirits or justify it in her mind. She simply acted. In her world, actions defined who you were more than words ever could. She pulled him farther from the river, away from open ground where patrols might search. She moved with purpose now, the hesitation gone, replaced by a focused urgency. If she was going to save him, she would do it completely. Half mercy was still a death sentence. Every sound in the forest felt louder as she worked. The snap of a twig made her freeze. The distant bark of a dog sent a sharp jolt of fear through her chest. She imagined riders appearing between the trees, rifles raised, accusations already forming. She knew what they would say, that she had stolen property, that she was aiding a criminal, that she deserved punishment for interfering in a system they called law. She also knew none of that mattered. Fear could not be allowed to make the decision for her now. As she dragged him deeper into the woods, her thoughts raced ahead to the consequences. If he survived, where would he go? He could not simply walk back into the world unchanged. His face, his body, his scars would mark him forever. And if he died under her care, that would mark her too, a secret she would carry alone. Either outcome bound her to him in ways she could not yet understand. She felt the weight of that bond settling even before he opened his eyes. There was also another risk she did not name aloud, the risk of attachment. Caring for someone so close to death required intimacy. She would see his pain, hear his dreams, feel his breathing beneath her hands. That closeness could blur lines that society had drawn in blood and law. She knew those lines well. She had been warned about them since childhood. Yet here she was, already crossing them without looking back. As night fell, the forest seemed to close around them, protective and threatening all at once. She lit no fire, relying instead on herbs and touch, on knowledge passed down through generations. She worked in near darkness, guided by instinct and memory, listening constantly for signs of danger. Every time he groaned or shifted, she flinched, afraid the sound would travel farther than it did. When he whispered incoherently, she placed a hand over his mouth, not harshly, but firmly, a silent promise that she would not let him be taken. In those hours, her choice hardened into something unbreakable. This was no longer a question of law or consequence. It became a question of who she was willing to be. She realized that if she left him now, she would carry that moment forever. The image of his body by the river, the knowledge that she had the power to intervene and chose not to. That, to her, was a heavier burden than any punishment others might impose. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on her limbs, but her resolve did not waver. She had crossed the invisible line already. There was no returning to the safety of ignorance. Helping him meant accepting whatever followed: pursuit, suspicion, danger, even exile. She understood that mercy was never free. It demanded payment in fear, sacrifice, and silence. As she watched his chest rise and fall, just a little steadier than before, she felt something settle deep within her, not regret, not pride, but certainty. Whatever the world might call this act, she knew its truth. She had chosen life over rules, humanity over safety, and in doing so, she had set both of them on a path from which there would be no turning back. The days that followed unfolded in quiet secrecy, measured not by time but by survival. Hidden deep within the forest, far from open paths and prying eyes, the Cherokee woman tended to the wounded man, as though the world beyond the trees no longer existed. The shelter she brought him to was modest, branches woven low, leaves layered thick for warmth, earth packed smooth beneath them, but it was enough. Enough to hide, enough to heal, enough to let something fragile begin without being seen. His body fought her at first. Infection had already taken hold, and the fever came in violent waves. Some nights he burned so hot she feared he would consume himself from the inside. Other nights his skin turned cold and clammy, his breathing so shallow she pressed her ear to his chest to make sure it was still there. She worked without rest, using poultices made from crushed roots and bark, changing them when they darkened with blood and pus. Each time she cleaned the wound, he groaned softly, his fingers curling instinctively around her wrist, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware of how much care it took to keep him alive. In his fevered state, he spoke often, not to her, but to memories. He whispered about fields and chains, about a mother whose face he could barely remember, about a child he had never seen grow. Sometimes he begged forgiveness from voices only he could hear. Other times, he cried out in fear, his body jerking as though reliving the moment he was struck down. Each time, she soothed him the same way, steady hands, low murmured words, calm presence. She did not understand every word he said, but she understood pain. As the fever slowly began to break, a new rhythm formed between them. She learned the sound of his breathing when he slept peacefully, and the sound it made when pain returned. He learned, in half-conscious moments, the feel of her hand offering water, the scent of crushed herbs, the way she spoke softly even when urgency filled her movements. When his eyes stayed open longer, he watched her closely, curiosity mixing with gratitude and confusion. He had expected cruelty or indifference if he survived at all, not patience, not gentleness. Silence became their shield. They spoke little, and when they did, it was carefully. Names were avoided. Questions were postponed. The less known, the safer they both were. But even without words, understanding grew. A glance meant stay still. A touch meant danger nearby. A long pause meant rest. In that quiet, something subtle took root, trust built not on promises, but on repetition. She returned every time he needed her. He endured because she believed he could. The forest around them became part of their bond. She taught him when it was safe to drink from the stream and when the water ran too high. She showed him which leaves could be chewed to ease pain, which insects meant rain was coming, which birds went silent when strangers passed through. He listened, absorbing not just information, but the care behind it. For the first time in his life, knowledge was being given freely, without threat or demand. As his strength returned, so did his awareness of what she was risking. One afternoon, when he was finally able to sit upright on his own, he looked at her and asked quietly why she hadn't left him. The question hung between them, heavier than either expected. She did not answer right away. When she did, it was simple. Because you were alive. That was all. No justification, no explanation. Yet in that moment, he understood something profound. She had seen him not as property, not as danger, not as obligation, but as a human being worth saving. That realization changed the way he looked at her. Gratitude deepened into something more complex. He became aware of her presence in ways that unsettled him. The strength in her posture, the steadiness in her gaze, the quiet resolve that never wavered. He noticed how exhaustion lined her face on nights she barely slept, how she still smiled faintly when he showed improvement. He began to fear not just being found, but being separated from the one person who had chosen him without condition. She felt the shift too, though she did not name it. The care she offered him had become instinctive, almost intimate. She knew the exact moment pain would flare before he spoke. She knew when his silence meant fear rather than rest. Each day he healed, relief mixed with unease. His survival meant success, but it also meant the end of this fragile, hidden world they shared. The closer he came to walking again, the closer came the question neither wanted to face. What happens next? The forest, once simply a place of refuge, began to feel like a boundary closing in. Their safety depended on isolation, yet their bond grew stronger within it. Every passing day made the outside world feel more distant, more hostile. They were two people who should never have met, bound by an act of mercy that had already crossed invisible lines drawn by law, culture, and fear. When he finally stood on his own, unsteady but alive, they shared a long look neither spoke through. Healing had done more than mend his body. It had woven their lives together in ways that could not be undone. What began as survival had quietly transformed into connection. And though neither dared say it aloud, both understood the truth. This was no longer just about hiding a wounded man. Something deeper had begun, something dangerous, something forbidden. What neither of them wanted to admit became impossible to ignore as the days passed. The bond that had formed in secrecy, shaped by survival and silence, was no longer just gratitude or duty. It had crossed into something far more dangerous. In a world governed by rigid laws, racial boundaries, and unforgiving punishment, what was growing between them had no name that could be spoken safely. It existed only in glances held too long, in pauses heavy with meaning, in the quiet understanding that neither of them was alone anymore. He noticed it first in the smallest ways. The way his chest tightened when she stepped away for too long. The way her absence felt louder than the forest sounds around him. When she returned each time, relief washed over him so intensely it frightened him. He had known fear all his life, but this was different. This fear came from the thought of losing someone who had never been his to begin with. Someone who, by every rule of the world they lived in, should never have mattered to him in this way. She felt it too, though she fought it harder. She had grown up knowing exactly where lines were drawn, between nations, between skin and skin, between what was allowed and what was punished. Loving him, even silently, meant stepping beyond those lines with no protection. She told herself again and again that what she felt was concern, responsibility, nothing more. But when she caught herself watching him as he slept, counting each breath without realizing it, she knew the truth was slipping past her defenses. There were moments when the weight of it nearly broke them. One evening, as they sat apart sharing food in silence, their hands brushed accidentally. The contact was brief, innocent by intention, yet it sent a shock through both of them. He pulled his hand back immediately, eyes wide with guilt and longing. She stood up too quickly, turning away, her heart racing. Nothing had been said, but everything had changed. From that moment on, awareness filled the space between them like a living thing. They tried distance. He insisted on walking farther from the shelter during the day, testing his strength, giving her space. She kept herself busy gathering herbs, staying away longer than necessary. But separation only sharpened what they were trying to bury. When danger crept close, voices in the woods, distant hoofbeats, instinct overruled restraint. She would grab his arm, pulling him down into cover. He would shield her without thinking. In those moments, fear stripped away hesitation, and what remained was undeniable. The truth was cruel in its simplicity. Their connection made no room for safety. If discovered, he would be dragged back into bondage or killed on the spot. She would be accused of betrayal, punished, possibly cast out from her people or worse. Their love, even unspoken, threatened not just them but everyone around them. And yet, knowing this did not extinguish it. It only deepened the ache. One night, Unable to sleep, he finally spoke what they had both avoided. He told her he would leave as soon as he was strong enough. He said it calmly, but his voice shook. He claimed it was for her safety, that staying any longer would only bring danger. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable in the fireless dark. When he finished, she nodded slowly. Then she said something that surprised them both. Leaving will not erase what already exists. That was the first time they acknowledged it out loud, not as love, but as something real and irreversible. No promises were made. No future imagined. They understood that wanting each other did not grant them the right to keep each other. Their world did not allow such mercy. Yet still, in that moment, honesty bound them closer than any declaration could have. From then on, every interaction carried the weight of what could never be. When she cleaned a scrape on his hand, her touch lingered a second too long. When he thanked her, his voice softened in a way that made her look away. They learned the discipline of restraint, not because desire faded, but because survival demanded it. Loving each other became an act of silence, of choosing not to take what was offered by instinct. The forest itself seemed to sense the tension. Nights felt heavier. Sounds carried farther. The shelter that once felt protective now felt fragile, temporary. Each sunrise brought them closer to an ending neither wanted to face. He grew stronger, his step steadier, his time there shorter, and with each sign of healing came a strange grief, because his recovery meant departure, and departure meant separation. There was no dramatic confession, no moment of surrender. Their love was shaped by restraint, by what they refused to do as much as by what they felt. In a different world, their story might have been simple. In this one, it was dangerous, forbidden not just by law, but by history itself. They both understood the final truth long before it was spoken. Mercy had saved his life, but love might cost them everything. And still, neither of them wished they had chosen differently. The consequences came quietly at first, then all at once. Love, once hidden safely in silence, has a way of leaving traces no matter how carefully it's guarded. It was a broken branch near the shelter, a footprint where none should have been, a rumor carried on the wind. Someone had passed too close. Someone had seen something. The forest that had protected them for so long began to feel exposed, as if its shadows could no longer keep secrets. The first real sign of danger arrived one morning when she returned from gathering roots and found him tense, listening. Distant voices drifted through the trees. Men, horses. The sound carried the hard edge of pursuit. Slave catchers didn't announce themselves, but their presence was unmistakable. He knew the rhythm of that hunt, the way voices spread outward, the way dogs were loosed to read the ground like a map. Panic flared, but it was controlled, sharpened by necessity. There was no time to argue, no time to pretend this moment wouldn't come. They separated without ceremony. She led him along a narrow deer path, only she knew, then stopped at a bend where the ground softened near the creek. She pressed something into his hand, dried food, a strip of cloth, a small carved token meant to ward off harm. Their eyes met, and everything they had never said pressed forward all at once. He wanted to reach for her. She wanted to tell him to stay. Neither did. Survival demanded restraint one final time. He turned and disappeared into the trees, carrying more than his freedom with him. She stayed behind to erase signs, to mislead the dogs, to draw attention away from the path he'd taken. It was a dangerous gamble, and she knew it. When the men found traces, they found her. Questions came hard and fast, edged with suspicion and threat. She answered carefully, truth wrapped in misdirection, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. They searched the area, but the forest gave up nothing. Eventually, frustrated, they moved on. But the damage was done. Eyes lingered, trust frayed, word spread. Within her community, concern turned to scrutiny. Whispers followed her steps. Elders spoke to her in quiet tones about caution and consequence. No accusation was made aloud, but the message was clear. The balance had been disturbed. What she had done could not be undone, and while compassion was honored, bringing danger to the people was not. She was asked to leave for a time, not as punishment, but as protection. It was a gentle exile, yet it cut deeply. She accepted without protest, knowing the choice she had made had always carried this price. As for him, his journey north was brutal. Freedom was not a straight path, but a series of narrow escapes, borrowed shelters, and constant fear. More than once, he thought he heard her voice in the wind, steady and calm, urging him forward. He carried her teachings with him, how to read the forest, how to listen before moving, how to endure without losing himself. When he finally reached a place where he could rest without chains, he did not celebrate. Safety felt incomplete without the one who had made it possible. Years passed, lives diverged. He built a quiet existence under a new name, working, learning, helping others move along the same hidden routes he once traveled. He never spoke her name aloud, but he honored her in action, choosing mercy even when bitterness would have been easier. She returned to her people eventually, older, steadier, carrying the weight of a story she rarely shared. She married late, or perhaps not at all, depending on who told it. But those close to her said, she kept a small token wrapped in cloth, touching it when the world felt heavy. The legacy of their love did not live in records or monuments. It lived in the way stories were told softly, without names, as lessons rather than confessions. It lived in the roads that remained open because someone had chosen to help. It lived in the children she taught to see humanity before law, and in the people he saved because he knew what mercy looked like when it risked everything. Long after both were gone, the story lingered along the river and in the woods. People spoke of a Cherokee woman who once hid a wounded man, and of a man who crossed borders because someone believed he should live. They argued about details, about endings, about whether love like that could truly exist in such a time. But the argument missed the point. The truth of it was never meant to be proven. It was meant to be remembered. Because in a world built to divide and destroy, their story became a quiet defiance. Mercy had turned into forbidden love, and forbidden love had left behind something stronger than fear. Not a tragedy defined by loss alone, but a testament to choice. They had chosen humanity when it was dangerous, restraint when it was painful, and courage when it offered no reward. And that choice, passed hand to hand through generations, became their lasting mark, a reminder that even when history closes its doors, love still finds a way to leave something behind.